The StrutFit Show, bringing retail into the future.
Hello and welcome to the StrutFit Show. I'm your host, Nayyar. I'm also the CEO of StrutFit, where our vision is the same as the vision for this show, to bring retail into the future. Every episode, I'll be joined by a guest who is leading or innovating in some part of the retail spectrum, from design to manufacturing to marketing and even to sales. We'll discuss trends, learnings, and ideas, and really try to figure out what the top performers in your field are doing. Along the way, we'll discover some lessons you can apply to your own career and hopefully even have some fun. All right, let's do it. So hey, I'm joined here by Alex Genov. Alex, thank you for joining me.
Sure thing, Ang. My pleasure.
Welcome to the StrutFit Show. And as I mentioned just before we started, the purpose of the StrutFit Show is to bring retail into the future. And the way we're doing that is we're inviting guests about every fortnight to come on the show and talk about their area of expertise. And we were talking earlier about how there's silos which occur in all industries, but especially in retail, where you get marketing and sales and product, and they all are focused on their own thing, and there's innovations and there's lots of interesting things happening there. But often we do a poor job, or we can definitely do a better job of sharing that across and making sure that knowledge is shared. So yeah, thank you for joining me. And I guess let's get into it. So perhaps we start with telling me a bit about your role. I know at a high level what you do, but perhaps go into a little bit more detail about your role at Zappos. And let's start there.
All right, sure thing, Ang. So at Zappos, I've been with Zappos almost 7 years now, and my role is to, at a very high level, help the organization understand customers as people on a deeper psychological level. So I head up customer research, customer experience research, which is basically incorporates a multitude of methods that range from interviews to surveys to usability research, all kinds of research that, again, have to do with more understanding what makes people tick, what makes our customers tick. We do have at Zappos a very awesome data science and analytics team, and they handle all the hard data, all the big data. I do not, I'm not an expert there, but I know enough to really respect them for what they do. This is the rocket science, what they do there. What we do is not rocket science, but I think the magic happens when our groups collaborate and really understand, on the one hand, what customers do, and then on the other, why they do it.
Awesome. Interesting. And you mentioned you've got this team of data scientists and analytics. Perhaps we zoom out a little bit and talk about empiricism versus rationalism and how that's come into, I guess, user research.
Sure. Just to clarify that the data science team is separate. It's not part of my group. They're a different group.
I see. And so they have some insights they'll share with you, but it's not necessarily always to do with customer research.
Right. Customer research is a separate group from data science.
Okay.
And speaking of silos, we do have different groups within Zappos. But what we do is try to break down the silos between those groups and really work together and collaborate.
Awesome. And I know some of that is to do with your holacracy method, which I'm really interested to get into later on. But yeah, sure. For now, let's talk about empiricism and rationalism and how that applies to customer research and how it's changed over time.
It's an interesting topic, near and dear to my heart, because I come from academic psychology. I have a degree in experimental social psychology, and I've learned quite a bit about empiricism and rationalism then. So it's a philosophical topic, right? It's basically how you know the world. And René Descartes, the famous rationalist, would sit down and read a lot of books and use logic, and that's how he would proclaim things like "I think, therefore I am." Right? You cannot test that statement really through research, because that's a philosophical point of view. And then to counter that, people like David Hume came along, and he's a very famous empiricist. and he would ask the question, "How do you know?" So when somebody makes a statement, right, it's cold outside. They say, "How do you know?" And that question became to be known as the wrecking ball of empiricism, as knowing that any statement you make, then if you ask them, "How do you know?" then it forces the conversation to talk about a shared reality and ways to measure things and ways for two people to look at the same thing and agree. Mm-hmm. Is it day? Is it night? Right? If it's light outside, if we both see the same thing, then we agree on it. So that's the foundation of then measuring. The field of measuring things. So if you're talking about the concept of length, right? Then we come up with a simple tool like a meter to measure it, and then we both look at it and we agree and say, "How do you know this object is that long?" Well, because we use the tool to measure it, and we both agree. So that is the basis of empiricism. It's try things, it's measure things, and have people objectively agree on the same thing. That is easy when it comes to physical, qualities like length and temperature. So we have tools for that. It becomes very interesting when we start talking about psychological concepts like emotion. Emotion is not a thing. Emotion is a construct, right? So then it boils down to how you measure it. Then you may have disagreements. Then you have to agree on the way to measure it, and then that's where it becomes really interesting. And my field back in the day was individual differences and emotions, and how you define emotions, how they get generated, how you measure them, and so on. So that's I try to bring that knowledge to my practical work for different companies.
Interesting. And so obviously we move towards a very empirical system now. Can we talk a bit about qualitative versus quantitative measurements? Because I understand they're both empirical, or would you say one is rational?
No, I would say they're both empirical. If we talk about measuring something, if we talk about researching something, we're in the realm of empiricism. Rationalism would mean you read a ton of books, right? Go back to the Greek, philosophers, and then write a very logical argument, right? Use logic, and then if it kind of makes sense, if you deduct one thing from another, then what you say must be true. That's rational. Empiricism, then you come and say, how do you know? Right? How did you measure it? How did you define it? So qualitative and quantitative data, when it comes to data, I'm glad you asked, because there's a lot of misunderstanding and misconception about that, especially in business circles. It's easy to hear things like qualitative data is when you measure, when you have a small sample size, for example. And quantitative is when you have a lot of observations, but that's not the case. Qualitative has to do with, first of all, how you do the research, and then how you use the observations. Qualitative data it can be observations, right? You observe people, and then you come up with hypotheses, or you come up with insights, right? So you come up with explanations of why they behave the way they do.
So what would be an example of, and perhaps you're about to jump into it, but what would be an example?
Yeah. So I can give you an example from one of our empirical research activities, which was a home visit, which is a contextual inquiry, or a form of ethnographic research, where we not only talk to customers, but we visit them in their home. So we understand the context of their life, and we see the objects, and we see the clothes and shoes in this case. We see their the environment. We see the apartment, the closets, right, and so on. So we visited this woman in the San Francisco area, who used to be a model in the past, and then she then became a researcher. A very bright woman, and she said something that was pretty remarkable. That kind of changes the way you think. So she said, when we talked about how she picks what to wear on a certain day, she goes, well, sometimes I kind of feel a little bit down in the morning, and then to improve my mood, she goes, I put on a piece of clothing that's pretty remarkable, so people talk to me about this. It starts a conversation, and that improves my mood. So you see how that's a great insight, because the way I thought about this before was that the way you dress matches your mood. So if you're feeling depressed, you're going to wear black, right? You're going to But instead, what she said is, I'm going to wear something to change that, right? And so that's an insight. That insight is qualitative. So one person said it; it's valid for that person. Then the question is, well, okay, what do you do with it, right? I can talk about it like it's a nice story, right? I can write about it and so on. But if you're a business, you want to make money from this insight, then you have to say, well, if I have many customers, how many of them would agree with that or would take that up? And then you have to quantify that insight. So that was a qualitative insight that you use to generate hypotheses, to generate ideas, to explain something. And then if you want to quantify it, then you have to turn it into numbers. So quantification means turning anything into numbers. And again, it doesn't have it's a completely separate subject from the sample size. You can have qualitative observation with 1,000 people, right? Or you can quantify the behavior of one person. So then if we, based on that insight, we write a similar question like, how often do you wear something so that other people talk to you in the morning, and then send it to 1,000 people, and then get the responses yes, no, and turn them into numbers, right? Yes, 1, no, 0. There you have your quantitative information. So you see, qualitative information has to do with insights and ideas and hypotheses, and quantitative information has to do with numbers.
Awesome. That was really comprehensive, and I think that'll make it very clear for a lot of people. When we're talking about, I guess, measuring a user and doing user research, I had a look at one of your slides, and you had something called 360 views. Could you talk a little bit about that and how you paint a full picture of a customer? Because I think it's very easy for companies who are perhaps starting off in customer research and don't have a fully fledged team, such as Zappos. Maybe they'll do one area of research and get kind of focus on that and think it's the complete picture. But yeah, how do you make sure you don't get tunnel visioned in just one area? Because I mean, you could do one type of research and come to one conclusion, but had you done 3 or 4 more, you might have reached the very opposite conclusion. So yeah, perhaps talk a bit about that.
Sure, thanks, and that's a great question. So I want to start off by saying that it doesn't have to do with the size of the team, right? We have a very small team at Zappos in terms of customer research, but it's a capable team, and I think it starts with a mindset, and that mindset to me is realize that customers are not numbers, right? And understand customers as people, and that's why we have separate teams. We have the teams that deal with the numbers, because that's what the business is based on. Numbers. It's run on numbers. We're reporting numbers. It's fine, right? You need to, at that scale, to run a business, you need numbers. But to create emotional connection with customers, to have customers become loyal to you, to talk about your business, to get these experiences, I think it's hard to do that if you don't understand customers as people. And then, first of all, start with that mindset, and then ask yourselves when was the last time you talked to customers, right? To see clicks, right? The numbers are not customers, they're clicks, they're conversions, right? They're visits. their dollars or whatever other currency. These are not people. So to understand people, you need to boil down your research to some kind of psychological research, if you will. You need to talk to them to understand their mindsets. When you do market segmentation, for example, the easiest forms of market segmentation, but in my mind, the least actionable and the most silly ones are demographic segmentation, right? Where the insights basically are that rich people buy more stuff, right? That's a groundbreaking insight if you think about it, right? Then every business will line up in front of the rich people's homes to get their business.
Yeah.
So it's easy because it's so straightforward. You can turn things into numbers easily. Men, women, age, they're numbers. But then when it comes to mindset and attitudes and all those psychological characteristics, more and more businesses are realizing that that's what motivates behavior, and that's why we have this very established and well-known field of behavioral economics now that realizes that economics that's based on math and the numbers is not really realistic the way humans behave, and humans are moved by emotion, by attitudes, by beliefs, and so on. So to bring it back to demographic segmentation, you may have a lot of wealthy people because you know their share of wallet or whatever, how you measure their wealth.
Mm-hmm.
But do you know how many of them have the mindset of being savers, right? Or penny pinchers? If you don't know that, you're going to send them an email, say splurge, right? You can afford it, right? But what you're going to hear is, unsubscribe, delete. I don't want to see that. Again, in our research, for example, we've seen very interesting mindsets. For example, we've visited families and talked about to mothers, right, who shop for their kids but don't shop for themselves. And then it's a very obvious strategy to say, why don't we just send them an email, say, buy yourself something nice, right? Well, what we found out was this concept of mommy guilt, which we heard from many people, was that, before I shop clothes for myself, now that I have kids, everything goes to the kid. And I feel guilty if I shop for myself. You see now, if you send an email that's, buy yourself something, right, too, versus we understand that, you may want to buy something now, but everything goes for the kid, right, and so on now, and then the person will be, you get me, right, and they'll probably be more open to try something. So that's it's about empathy ultimately, right? It's the same thing when you did your application. If you say, it's super easy, right, you just point and shoot, and they're like, well, no, it's not, because XYZ. Right, and then you say, well, let me help you. It may not be easy, but I'll walk you through, right? And then it means that you empathize with you. So I don't know what, I kind of lost track of the initial question. I talked too much.
That was good. That was good. All right. So, imagine I'm a retailer who's listening to this podcast, and I'm like, wow, I really like what Alex is saying, and we've been too focused on Google Analytics, which don't paint a full picture, because it's pretty low fidelity information, right? Like you don't get the qualitative stuff coming through, and that's perhaps where some key insights can happen, like the one you just described. So say I'm a retailer and I'm like, all right, Alex, you've convinced me. I want to have a more complete view of a customer. How would you suggest they go about doing it? And perhaps to paint your picture, maybe say they've got 30 people in head office. So they might be doing something like 10 to 50 million online. So not a huge team. They're not going to have 3 user researcher people. But they're like, we want to dip our toes. How would you suggest they get into it?
Yeah, now I remember where I started from. Yeah, it was all about using different methods. So if you start with that mindset of let's understand customers, then you're gonna end up using different methods. Like you said, let's track the numbers. This is absolutely necessary, which is the what, but let's understand the why too. And then you can do, again, the size of the team doesn't matter. You can have one person. but that person then will work together with the data scientists and the analysts to bring that insight of the why to the what. So then you can you can start by doing a survey, which is not a perfect tool, but it's the best tool we have to understand what's in people's minds at scale, right? Currently. Then you can do even more in-depth understanding by doing one-on-one interviews where you talk to a person and then you follow up with questions and you follow a certain path, right? And you understand them even deeper. Mm-hmm. Then you can go to people's homes and observe and you build that full picture, right? You kind of build it with each activity. You answer more questions and you build a fuller picture. I think at the end of the day, one essential thing to have is to store all data about that customer in one database, so where you can connect the dots. So because if you collect a ton of data, but it all goes to different databases that don't talk to each other, you'll never realize that that's the same person. It's the same person that came to your website 3 times, looked around, searched for a certain thing, maybe left some feedback, and the voice of the customer will say, yeah, I'm confused, right? Maybe then they called customer service. And then if you don't connect those dots, then, you know, each person in each respective group will say, oh, you have one hit here, we have one call here, we have, you know, this here, never realizing that that's the same person. Right, and if you have people that continue to visit and don't find what they're looking for and get frustrated and ask for help and never get it, and then they leave, right? And then you'll never know why. You know, you say abandoned cart, and then you're going to send them an email, right? Why did you abandon the cart? Why did you abandon it? But maybe this person used the cart to just store things because you don't have a favorites list. But they use it as a favorites list and they never abandon, right? So again, the more you understand, the better you're going to be at helping people, which will translate in sales ultimately.
Yeah, and that's a key point there in terms of translating to value. And I think that you've been a big advocate for, you know, it's fine to do the research, but at the same time we're a business and we need to ultimately generate sales. Sure. And generating sales is I think a subsection of delivering value in the first instance. But say I'm a retailer, same sort of retailer, and I'm like, no, I understand my customer. Like, we're doing pretty well in our sales. I understand my customer. I know what they want. How would you convince someone like this? And perhaps an example might be to talk about a win where you were surprised. Maybe you went into some research with a hypothesis and actually you were surprised, and that insight or that result generated ultimately revenue for the business.
Yeah, I mean, one of this favorites feature, for example, was one of the insights, because we have several, sister websites. One is 6pm.com. And, before the Amazon acquisition, Zappos had acquired that website. And it was people loved it. They were very loyal followers. We pioneered our voice of the customer feedback loop on 6pm. And a lot of customers were asking for favorites lists. Right? So at the same time, right, you saw this, these data points about what looked like cart abandonment. People put a lot of stuff in cart and never come back. So we started putting these two together, and then based on the feedback, the team developed the favorites list, and then the inquiries became praise. Oh, great feature, and so on. So, and that in itself now cleaned up the data for the data science and analytics team to have now a much better understanding of when a cart is abandoned versus it's used as just like a storage place. Mm-hmm. So that's one practical insight.
And how many, just out of interest, how many people were using it? Like, what percentage of people were using it as favorites instead of actually?
I don't know. I mean, I can't talk about specific numbers here, but I mean, enough to
Like a surprising amount.
Right. I mean, and again, I think that's the question of finding something and then quantifying it. It's going to vary for different businesses, but you need to verify it, and that's one of our main goals now for our Voice of the Customer program is to validate comments and then quantify them, and then see which ones line up with the business priorities and so on. So you can't just, if somebody says I cannot check out, just start changing checkout because of that. You need to investigate. That's part of the rigor you put into to validate and so on.
Interesting. Could we talk a bit about this Voice of the Customer program? And then, I don't know if this is related, but I saw something about non-verbal measures of emotion. That also sounds super interesting. So if it's linked, talk about them together, but otherwise maybe talk about Voice of the Customer first.
They're separate, yeah.
Okay.
The other one is the non-verbal is more related to the empirical in our initial topic. But the Voice of the Customer program, we started about 7 years ago, and it was to really help the business listen to the customer and get that feedback. And it was a long journey. It was, partly long because we were back then in this self-organization mode, which was called holacracy. You asked about this before. It was one of Tony Hsieh's experiments with how we work. And the idea was to not organize around people or roles, but more around the work. There was still hierarchy, of course, and there were still groups that they were called circles, but then you could be part of many circles, not just one group. And if you're passionate about a piece of work, like we were about giving customers a voice, we started this group ourselves. It was completely grounds up, and then we got associated with a higher level analytics circle, and we got budget and so on. So it grew, and then we found somebody, a really awesome developer who wrote a little internal survey tool for us, so we could capture the data securely behind our servers and not use third-party tools, because data privacy and security are of utmost importance for us, being part of Amazon, of course, as it should be for any company. So we don't store sensitive information on any third-party databases. And so we developed that, and we went through a series of challenges and so on. One of the biggest ones was to make it actionable, in the sense that we heard that from our executives: don't just report numbers like net promoter score dropped, but why? What's the root cause? What can we fix? And those insights were hidden within the text data, which is unstructured, right? Qualitative data. And then we needed a tool to structure it and to figure out what was hidden, the insights that were hidden in those mountains of text data.
So to clarify there, you sent out surveys, and you have basically heaps of text from those customers, and you're like, cool, we have all this, but now what can we do with it, and what is it actually useful for?
Exactly. So there are surveys, there are links that persist on the website, and if people opt in to give us feedback, they say, I would like you to recommend Zappos to a friend or family, which is the net promoter score, and then how can we improve Zappos? And then they write their paragraph. They can say something: I love Zappos, don't change, it's perfect, right? Or they can say, I love Zappos, but lately I've been having a tough time finding the shoes I like, or something like that. And so because of that, text can be first of all positive or negative, and then to hear the positive is nice, the praise, but then you can't do much about it other than just feel good about it.
Yeah.
But then you want to go and understand why these customers are frustrated, and that's where you need AI to figure it out, to parse it. And in a long paragraph, people may be talking about 3 different problems that then are handled by 3 different teams. So, for example, we may be just out of stock for certain shoe size, and that doesn't make sense to send that to the technology team or to the dev team, because they can't do much about it. I need to send that to the merchandising team. And then within technology, you have teams that handle search, that handle checkout, other areas. So that's why the comment needs to be parsed in terms of root cause analysis. So we were on a long journey, and we found a really great partner, this startup out of England called Chattermill, that we're partnering with now, that have a really great AI, but also a very good DIY software that lets us go in and select certain facets or aspects and create reports and so on. So that once we started quantifying, the qualitative insights, we started gaining the attention of his executives in a way. And I mean, they were rightfully skeptical to begin with. And then as we started quantifying, as they started seeing overlapping patterns with other parts of the business, then they really started paying more attention to it, to the point now that I send a batch of customer comments every week to the CEO if he reads them, and then he engages the executive team. They had several meetings with the executive team that they started with customer comments. Right, so that's a very nice evolution to paying attention to customers.
Wow, and it sounds like it's come a long way from basically an idea where you're like, hey, we should, let's be listening to customers, and 7 years later, the CEO reads insights every week from that same project.
I mean, mind you, this at the time when we started the project, Zappos was and still is the most customer-centric company when it comes to customer service, right? It was the focus was more on a specific channel, which was the phone lines and so on. And Zappos was still extremely customer-centric. I'm not implying that Zappos was not customer-centric at the time. It's just we just opened up a different channel.
Yeah. And on opening up different channels, so phone lines obviously very verbal, and text is perhaps a subsection of being verbal as well via the surveys. Be interested to talk about this nonverbal measures of emotion, and I guess what that means, and how you even elicit. Is it something to do with being able to elicit people's emotions while they're browsing? Like, how does this work?
No, it's measuring. It's defining and measuring emotion, and that again, my interest dates back to my graduate work on emotions. And in my dissertation, I measured the role of actual psychophysiological changes versus the belief that your physiology is changing on your perception of fear, for example. And then also there was another aspect of individual differences to the extent to which people listen to their own bodies when it comes to feeling and emotion. So, for example, there's this theory called self-perception theory that was started but was developed by William James back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
It was very counterintuitive. He basically said that it's not that you feel confident and then you sit up straight. You say you stand up straight, and then you project more with your voice, and then you're going to feel more confident. He said it's the other way around, because he understood that the way our own minds interpret emotions by the way we behave. So he would say we're not running because we're afraid. We feel stronger fear because we run.
This is quite similar to the insight from the model from California, I think you were saying, where she put on something to actually feel a certain way, not she didn't put something on because she felt that way.
She engineered social interactions, and indeed she would also put on and then indeed, right? Because otherwise it would be if you feel down and you grab your way and then you slump over and then look down, then people are gonna even avoid you even more in a way, right? So then it becomes a vicious cycle. But so that was the whole idea of the expression of emotion. Our body first reacts, and then our perception, our internal states get generated, and then we perceive it as such. It's much more applicable to strong emotions like fear and anger and so on. So the louder you shout, the more angry you're going to feel, for example. But in a way, facial expressions of emotions are a big part of that. And At some point, they developed the technology first to capture the facial configuration, right? So I think Google and others developed that software that now is used for facial recognition, right? For law enforcement, if you will, all that stuff, for biometrics. So the iPhone, when they say face, right, face lock, whatever, they use that software because it knows your features. Now, then another other scientists developed another piece of software that then codified what psychologists have had studied on paper, with pencil and paper, which was Paul Ekman developed this technology called the action facial coding scheme, or something like this, facial action coding scheme. He basically, on piece of paper, he would say, are your eyebrows together like this? Is this teeth clenched, right? Or are the corners of the mouth up? And so if there was a certain configuration, this equaled fear, another configuration equaled anger, another configuration equaled disgust, and so on. So the software developers then developed that technology to work on top of the facial recognition software, and they developed essentially software that now, and there's several companies. I've worked with a couple of them, but the last company I worked with was called Realize, and it's really amazing. So they developed this platform where they recruit 300 people, and then they would agree to start their video camera, right? All this, agree to the research and so on. Start their video camera, and then they would play them let's say a commercial, 30-second commercial. And the software captures your facial expression second by second, and it codifies it into interest and positive, smiling, negative, and that overlaps it with the actual frame, each frame of the video. So at the end, they basically can measure how effective that ad was. Did people get it? Were they confused? Did they like it? Did they smile? If it was funny, did they cry if it was sad, and so on. So that is the technology that captures that. When you talked about phone calls, there is technology to capture emotion through the voice. The voice carries a lot of emotion. That's all huge data, right? I mean, if you put that at scale, then we're talking about enormous data, right? Not big data, but humongous data.
Yeah. Nice. Wow. Interesting. That's so cool. So I guess another place you would use that would be, I mean, it doesn't just have to be ads. You could have people doing that while they're like browsing your website and matching that to where they are and seeing perhaps where frustrations on the website are.
Exactly. So that can be applied. Of course, now the emotions have to be appropriate for that experience, because you cannot apply Paul Ekman's scheme directly, right? If you're going shopping for shoes, most likely you're not going to experience fear, you're not going to experience disgust, right? I mean, the same way that you see something really disgusting and you go like, that make the face of disgust, right?
Yeah.
Hopefully not, right? I mean, these shopping experiences are now pretty standard. So, but I think you should modify it to include confusion, to include delight, surprise in a nice way, or surprise in a bad way. And it's really that is the next, to me, the next frontier. That, of course, again, requires a lot of bandwidth, because imagine the data you collect for 30-second commercial. Well, now if you're browsing for like 5-10 minutes, that kind of data really adds up.
100%. I was listening to one of your talks, and I really like the analogy of the elephant and the blind men, and how that applies to business and companies, and I guess teams within companies. Could you tell us that story? And and then how it relates to companies. And I found it to be very potent. I think people will enjoy it.
Sure, and thank you. Yeah, I mean, first of all, thank you for doing all your homework and listening to all this. It's I use it as an analogy of silos within companies, and the original story dates back to Sanskrit times and so on. And the story was that in this small village, remote village, where they had never seen an elephant, this strange animal came, and then the leader of that village sent 5, well, at the time, men, let's say. It was not a very kind of diverse or politically correct story back in the day. But 5 men that happened to be blind to go and figure out what the animal was and come back. And so they went and each used the faculties that they had, which was touch and so on, and hearing, and but they mostly used touch, and each person touched a certain part of the animal. And they came back, and when the head of the village, let's say, asked them, "So what's an elephant?" The person who touched the trunk said, "Well, an elephant is like a big tree." And then the person who touched the body said, "No, you're completely wrong. It's like a wall." And then another person who touched the tusk is now, "No, you both are wrong. It's like a spear. So what are you talking about?" And so, of course, you understand there was no agreement. And that's because they didn't see the full picture. They couldn't see the full picture. So that's the analogy I then translate to companies that have very strict silos and like a very strict org chart where different parts of the company don't communicate necessarily. And if you talk about customer research, for example, and you have these different organizations with their own budgets, with their own teams, their own agendas, the customer researcher or the market researcher that researches the market and the effectiveness of marketing materials may not talk to the product researcher who researches the actual product and the usability of the product. Then you may have a product in customer service and so on. You may have a research in customer service. And when you ask them who is the customer, then all those researchers may not agree. Right? They may say a customer is somebody who clicks on our ads, or the other one's the customer is somebody who uses the product in a certain way.
Mm.
Or a customer is somebody who has these needs and wants, and they don't agree on who the customer is. So that highlights the need to break down those silos, and even if you have a very structured and siloed organization, back in the day, at Zappos, Tony Hsieh kind of did away with the org chart, but that's because it's kind of more of a radical, innovative in that respect. But even if you can do away with the org chart, then at least you can do things like create maybe like a customer council that you gather stakeholders throughout the company that are customer facing and sit and discuss who is the customer. And when you plan the research, then maybe you pool your resources together, and then you're going to be much more efficient. You're going to maybe do one study and inform 5 groups within the company.
Mm. And then perhaps the change will also be faster because the change perhaps requires coordination across all these different silos as well.
Exactly. So to me, it can be more efficient in terms of resources. I mean, how many times in big companies there's a report by the marketing group, and then the product researcher like, "Hey, damn, I wish I knew you were doing this survey. I get some questions." So now they have to do their own questions with a different group of customers. Then you cannot connect the dots, and so on. So that can be a problem.
For sure. We're probably coming towards the end of our conversation, but there's a few questions I like to ask, and I guess one would be, what's some low hanging fruit that you see? Again, well, let's talk about that retailer. You've got about 30 staff in head office doing somewhere between 10 to 50 million. What's some low hanging fruit in customer research or market research, which they could go off and win really easily. Again, perhaps they haven't done too much of the customer research, and maybe it is starting something like this customer council. But yeah, what would be like the first thing you're like, hey, if you did this, it wouldn't take a lot of time and it would actually be very valuable. What would that be?
I mean, I would say it's probably sitting down as an organization and having the different stakeholders and having this discussion of how well do we know our customers, and how well, and a lot of companies now have really rigorous data collection and so on the quantitative side. But then have this conversation around let's understand the why behind the what. So yeah, so having that conversation, and then really from that point on understanding what the gaps are. Another piece of advice I would say is to start with the business objectives and research, and then translate those into research questions, and then and only then decide on the methods. Because many times companies that are customer centric or want to be customer centric start with let's do a focus group, and then the focus group now is kind of has become somewhat of a laughing stock in a lot of circles. I mean, it used to be the research method back in the day of Madison Avenue, the Madman and so on, Madman era of advertising. The focus groups were really, now they make fun of focus groups on Saturday Night Live. It's hilarious.
Yeah.
Or to say, let's do a survey. And then others will start criticizing the survey. Surveys are not good. It's like criticizing, starting saying, I want to do, I want to do a household project, and I'll start with a screwdriver. And then
it's like, what does that even mean? Like, what are you trying to do, right?
And then you say, then somebody says, hey, a screwdriver is terrible for painting walls, and then start criticizing the screwdriver, and then you get into this conversation that's really pointless. If you start with the what and then figure out the how, I think that's the way to go.
Nice. And in terms of, it's the other side of that question is, what are things that you see people doing wrong in customer research? And it's like I'm sure there would be some common thing which you're like, why do people do it this way? They shouldn't. So what would be something like that?
I mean, yeah, to reiterate, starting with the method would be definitely not the best. Then, so that's in terms of data collection. Then if you don't connect the dots, if you don't store the data in the right format, then in the right database to connect all the dots, then of course you won't be able to do the right analysis, right? Because to do, for example, if you want to ask 10 different questions of your customer base, and you say, that 10 questions is too long of a survey, so I'll do 2 surveys with 5 questions each. Then it comes back. Then, of course, you can do the descriptive statistics on those 5 questions, and they're going to be valid. But you won't be able to connect the answers to a question from one survey to the answers to the questions of the other surveys. Because to be able to do those analytics, you need to have the same person answer all the questions. Then over 1,000 or 2,000 people, you start seeing the patterns, right? Because the same person, you can do all the correlations and the cross tabs and all the statistical analysis, that chi-square and so on. Only if the same cohort took the survey, right? So I mean, we're going into like tactical things, but I think, and then one of the most important things is to close the loop with the customer. And if you get a lot of feedback from them, then first of all, thank them, because that feedback is a gift, and then make sure that you take it seriously and make some changes based on that.
Closing the loop, important. Got it. And one of my final questions will be around resources, and this is kind of a personal gain because I'm fascinated by psychology as well, and one of my favorite books is Influence by Cialdini, and then his next book Persuasion, which was also fascinating. I have seen your, I don't know how recent it was, but the post with all the links, there was some TED Talks in there and some other things, and I'll link to that in the show notes for this. But are there any particular books or resources you would recommend for people who are getting into it, and you're like, like top 3 books for people interested in psychology and perhaps even how that applies to customer research?
Yeah, I mean, it's on the top of my head. I mean, I used to study the source for all the psychology, research from the
like the actual PhD papers.
All the research, right? And then some people, I mean, like Robert Cialdini, he's very good at popularizing it. But then you have other people like Malcolm Gladwell who take all of that and make it really engaging and really fun. So any Malcolm Gladwell's books. There's one person that I really enjoy his talks. It's called Rory Sutherland. He talks about behavioral economics, and he's in advertising, but he acknowledges the role of psychology, and he has great examples. I mean, one of his things is, and speaking of resources, he says a lot of issues can be fixed paying attention to the detail, not spending a lot of money, but really understanding the motivation of customers and then having the right tweaks, not like huge, very expensive projects. Like one of his examples is when there's merger between 2 companies that's worth billions of dollars, how many of the customers really feel the impact? Like probably 0, right? Right. It's this huge deal, but when you go and maybe do a small tweak that really customers care about, that changes their lives, then it's kind of there.
Interesting. Super cool. Wow, I think that's everything I had to cover. Is there anything else you think we should have talked about but didn't?
Oh, great questions. Thank you. You did your homework.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Alex, for joining me. And I'll link to everything in the show notes, and people can follow up there. And if people want to connect with you, LinkedIn, is that the best place for them to do so?
LinkedIn is the best place, yes.
Awesome. All right. Cheers, Alex.
Thank you, Ang. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for joining me for this episode of The StrutFit Show. I've been your host, Ang Nayyar. And if you enjoyed it, if you found some parts where you were like, this has added some value to my life, then please share it with a few other people that you think would also value this information or that snippet. And when they like it as much as you did, I'm sure they'll thank you. If you're interested in what we're doing at StrutFit, head to our website at www.strut.fit to learn more and get in touch with us. If you want to get in contact with me directly, you can reach me at ang@strut.fit. All right, that's all, folks. Till next time, take care.